Stephen Hillier, Chief of the Air Staff, Craig Marsh from University of Lincoln.
Craig,
it's great to see you. Thank you so much for your time here. So, Stephen, we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so, if that's okay with you, just exploring this subject that we hear so much about, which is the millennial generation who are now forming the solid part of our recruits into our organisation. So, very interested to hear your views on this generation. What are they doing that's different, if anything? And then some of the implications of that for both the organisation and for leadership within the RAF, if that's okay. So that's the sort of the theme of the conversation. So perhaps we could start by your perspective on the first part of that question. So in your experience and what you've seen in the RAF, is there anything particularly different or new that you're seeing now from the generation of recruits coming into the RAF?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think the first thing is always just to keep a sense of perspective, because throughout human history, then each generation sees either the preceding or succeeding generation as being different to them in some respect. So I think we need to just have that perspective. Yeah. I think there's also a part of when I look at the young people joining the Air Force today, there is probably more that's the same with previous generations than is different. And I think always have keep in mind that the people who join the RAF do so because they look at the organisation and they want to be part of it. So there's a certain sense of the ethos, the spirit, the character, the traditions as well that they want to be a part of.
And you don't see that change. That's not changed at all in a sense. You're still seeing that coming in. They still have that passion and that sense of mission as they're coming in.
Absolutely. that sense of purpose. I mean, for all the reasons that people have always joined the RAF, there's a lot of similarity. Right. But then, as I say, putting that to one side, I think there are areas where I can definitely see a difference. And those differences are, some of it is in terms of the qualifications and skills that they bring. We generally see a much higher percentage now who have been, educated to university level, and this goes across the rank spectrum of the Royal Air Force. And that's not a surprise, because 20 years plus ago, the government said that their aim was to get 50% of people through, young people through university. So we're now seeing that. So they're more highly educationally qualified on average. That also means that on average, they're older when they join the RAF. And typically now the average age for joining the RAF, again, across our rank and trade structure, is around about 21, 22 years old.
So that's quite different from a generation ago.
So that's very different. So rather than what we would traditionally get is a more bias towards teenagers who, if you like, were still forming their view in the world, then we get people who have had the opportunity already. And that changes their perspective. Yeah. I think what then flows from that is that they have an entirely justified expectation of getting more responsibility earlier, progressing more quickly. They are impatient. They want to progress. They don't want to have a sense of, time served, just keep your head down and eventually things will come to you. They want those things to be there. And they expect the RAF as an employer to put those opportunities in front of them.
So there's a high degree of expectation on the RAF in terms of because of the age difference, because of their level of qualification, that they're going to get more from the RAF in terms of their careers than perhaps a 17-year-old would have had a different set of expectations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually, I welcome that. I want people who challenge us as an organisation. We put a lot of emphasis of how do we empower people, how do we drive responsibility down through our organisation so we can exploit the talents that we have. That's the sort of thing which keeps us on our top of our game as an organisation. So that higher level of expectation, that impatience to get on and do things quickly and get more responsibility. I mean, that's got to be healthy for us as an organisation.
So you welcome that challenge. So there's actually some very interesting insights there. So in terms of these 21-year-olds, often said that they have a different sort of set of values to previous generations of 21-year-olds. And you've quite rightly mentioned the generation gap. In some ways, that's always been said. But I think it's been said that in some cases they're a little bit more... they're not quite so oriented towards spending their entire careers in one organisation. They're a little bit more picky about how they about the sorts of organisation they choose to work for. They're less accepting of authority than previous generations. That they are perhaps a little more selfish towards their own careers rather than, providing an organisation with their lives, if you like. Are you seeing that happening by comparison with previous generations or not? Would you say that's just...
Well, yes, I do see that. But again, in so many ways, I welcome it.
Yeah.
They certainly, I feel that they have a stronger sense of purpose and that they are more values-driven. They are certainly far more connected into the wider world through all, be it social media, whatever technological means, but they are better informed of the world and a very clear focus on making a difference. And, it's very noticeable that whenever the RAF does a major humanitarian relief operation, there's a spike in interest in recruitment.
Is that right? So you actually can track that?
So we can see that when that happens. So when we did the disaster relief in the Caribbean about 18 months ago, and that says something to me about sort of people being much more values driven. In terms of their expectation and being less sort of hierarchical, I think that's right. And again, I welcome it. And I clearly can't comment on sort of other armed forces or other sectors. But from an Air Force perspective, we've always sort of tried to do that as much as possible because we recruit talented people and we aim to train and develop them as much as we possibly can. And it's one of the expressions that I've used is, how do we see past rank in our organisation? Okay. Now, rank is always going to be important to us. That's part of our, how we do business as an armed force. But we need to not assume that rank equals experience or capability. And so I try to encourage as much as I possibly can people to try and find out what is an individual's capabilities. The most junior person in the room may well be the most experienced and capable person in the room. And
may have the answer that you need.
They have the answer that you need, but you may well have to go and find that out for yourself.
And you mentioned a couple of minutes ago the word empowerment, I think was the word you used in context of leadership. Is that something that you feel is now becoming more important for the leadership task, given some of those changes in values that you're seeing?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and it's partly for that reason that I mentioned, is that we need to empower people throughout our structure of our organisation, because the most junior person may be the most knowledgeable, maybe the most technically skilled in that particular area. So unless you empower that individual, then the organisation will not be as good as it could be. And I mean, and this places a challenge on leaders. Is that how do you maintain your authority, your ability to set the vision and the guidance for an organisation when you are leading others who may be more capable than yourself?
Particularly if you've got to your leadership position by virtue of your expertise and your ability, so that becomes almost a challenge to your sense of who you are as a leader, I guess. Is that? Would you say that's true?
Well, certainly, and I mean, and I've seen examples of that where when I've talked to audiences about empowerment and about how we need to drive responsibility down to as low as possible a level as we can in the organisation, that some of the leaders then respond and say, "Well, if you do that, what's left for us to do?" And of course, the answer has to be, well, why wouldn't you want to exploit the maximum capability out of your team? And if you've got an even more capable team, then that enriches you and empowers you as a leader. But you may have to do different things. You might not try and just be the best specialist in the room.
Right.
You need to understand the specialisation, but you need to be the best leader in the room.
Indeed. So and so that's really interesting. So as you've picked on this, and I've got this kind of conception of perhaps somebody who's been in the RAF for perhaps several years and has achieved a position of status and rank. So perhaps isn't necessarily in this generation we're calling the millennials. So they may be a little bit older, a bit more experienced. How does the RAF help to develop that individual as a leader who perhaps isn't necessarily from this generation, isn't necessarily sharing the same value set, and does perhaps almost have this direct challenge or I wouldn't say threat, but it almost a challenge to who they are as a senior member of the organisation.
Well, I mean, I think it is, what I was touching on there is to encourage them, firstly, to connect across that entire spectrum of people within the organisation, is to understand what those capabilities are.
Yeah.
I mean, in October last year at Cranwell, we had the first ever joint graduation, and I think that was an important demonstration of how the Air Force sees itself.
Yeah.
Is a joint graduation of officers and airmen and airwomen from Halton. And I made the point very clearly to a number of those graduating officers that amongst the cadre of airmen and airwomen, then there were over 20 of them had first degrees and 6 of them had master's degrees.
Yeah.
So you need to go and speak to these people because they have the experience and capability that you need. So it's that connection and communication and understanding that leaders have to have. But then it's trying to encourage leaders to see that they now have the opportunity to lift themselves up to the higher level and to do what leaders should do, which is focus on providing the vision, the sense of purpose, the direction and guidance, and motivating those people to be even better.
Right.
And to fully appreciate that as a leader, if they see their team thriving, their team's success will be their success. And that sometimes as a leader, they'll be taken by surprise about what their team have achieved. And to say to them, those are the best moments as a leader.
And you can live their success vicariously as a leader yourself. Some might, who are less familiar perhaps with the Royal Air Force may say that perhaps the rank structure would get in the way of that conceptualisation of leadership. I'm sure people would recognise that as a leadership idea. What would you say to that? Do you think the rank structure is now becoming slightly out of date in terms of that sort of modern, or how does the relationship work between that sense of empowering leadership and the fact that you have tabs on your shoulder or stripes on your shoulder that represents the Queen's authority, actually?
Yeah, it's an important part of who we are as an organisation to have that rank structure, and a promotion through that rank structure is an important part of our reward and recognition. It brings remuneration, it brings additional privileges. And we need to always appreciate that we connect into other organisations, across the joint enterprise. So it remains an important part of what we are and how we do our business. But what we can't allow it to be is a strict hierarchical approach, because if the idea at the foundation level of our organisation has to go through 7 filters before it gets to a decision maker, it will just be killed off. Yeah. So it's
true in many organisations, certainly in the universities.
So we need to understand when it is important to work within the hierarchy, and that's when we're doing command and control in particular, because there are real risks if we don't do that correctly. But also understand when we want to flatten that structure as much as possible. An example of that is we have the Rapid Capabilities Office, which is it does what the title suggests. And in that organisation, we have people at the foundation level rank in the RAF reporting direct to 1-stars, because the 1-star is the decision maker, and that foundation level rank, the senior aircraftsman or woman, is the expert. Why would you have intervening layers if they're not adding value? So, I mean, I try to encourage, say we will always respect that rank structure. But one of the ways I describe it is, as military people, when we're introduced to somebody and we're in uniform, one of the first things we do is there's a little glance to the shoulder. And you see the rank and you respect that rank, but don't assume that rank equals the experience and capability. You've got to see past the rank to the individual, and getting that balance right is, I think, one of those. If somebody had been sitting in this chair 30 years ago, a chief of the air staff, then I think there'd be much more towards the hierarchical part of it rather than the see to the individual approach.
And the organisation that you mentioned is very, very interesting. Would you see that as being almost like horses for courses, that was set up for a particular mission? Or would you see it almost as an example of a glimpse into the future, perhaps almost, of the Royal Air Force and how the organisation may work as an empowering structure, but also within the defined authority or rank?
I do see it in the right context. I mean, it would be hard to replicate that everywhere, because how would you then make the transition from the foundation level rank to the decision maker rank if it was such a sort of a difference between the two? But in the right circumstances, it's absolutely correct. And it extends into our primary business, our flying business as well, is that we create an environment around flying where everybody has the opportunity to call something if they think it's wrong. And in our briefs and debriefs, we absolutely flatten out that structure. And I kept myself current on Tornado in this job. And the last time I did my pilot check, there was me in the front seat as a 4-star and a flight lieutenant in the back seat. And he's the captain of the aircraft, and he's the person who's picking up my faults and debriefing me. And we absolutely see that as that's how we should do business, is that rank in that context is absolutely no predictor of outcomes. Right. So we do this as part of how we do business, and we need to encourage it throughout the.
It's really interesting. I think perhaps a lot of people will have seen that the Red Arrows debrief as a primary example of that levelling out, and indeed is used as an example of best practice for other organisations now and then. So,
well, the Red Arrows approach is that. And again, we try to do this across the flying in the RAF, is that you are required yourself to highlight the things you got wrong. Yeah. If you try and hide it and somebody else calls you out, then that's a real sort of that's not how we should be. So creating the right sort of atmosphere, I think, is healthy, not just for safety risk management, but also just how we do our business day to day.
You mentioned Cranwell, and there's a lot of work going on at the moment, thinking through how the Royal Air Force does its basic training, both in terms of what was Halton and also the initial officer training. In your perspective, Stephen, what is it that is going to be different about how young leaders are trained in the RAF, given some of the circumstances that we've been discussing?
So I think that going for that common entry point into the Royal Air Force, I mean, that's part of it is ethos and history and tradition. Yeah. The RAF Cranwell's the spiritual home of the RAF. So if you're joining the RAF, that's where you should start. And I think that anybody who's arrives there and sees Cranwell just feels that they're become part of this big organisation with this long history. But what we also want to try and achieve is that better connection across our structure, because that will enhance that communication that I mentioned about that understanding that these individuals who, for example, the officers are subsequently going to lead, that understanding of just how skilled, how talented the rest of the Air Force is, and how big a responsibility that they will carry. That's got to be healthy for the organisation also. So, and it also, I believe, says something about, again, who we are as the RAF is an organisation which searches out talent and potential and is not hidebound by a rank structure. Is I strongly believe that that's what the RAF is about.
And Stephen, perhaps I could finish with perhaps a slightly more personal reflection, if I may, as you come towards the end of your term as Chief of the Air Staff, and perhaps anything that has driven you as a senior leader in the Royal Air Force over the years. Perhaps your principles of leadership, your philosophy of leadership that perhaps young leaders who are watching this might be able to listen to and learn from.
So, yes, I mean, this is one of those moments for reflection. And I always sort of preface this by saying that I didn't join the Air Force to be the Chief of the Air Staff. I wasn't one of these people who sort of said, well, I want to lead the organisation. I mean, I don't think I'd have been able to describe the head of the organisation when I joined it. I joined the RAF because I wanted to be part of the RAF and I wanted to fly aircraft. As I've gone through my career, I similarly have not had that sort of, if you like, naked ambition, is that just at each level that I've been at, once I've got comfortable at that level, I've looked to the next highest level and thought, well, there's more responsibility there, there's more opportunity, I'd like to have a go. And every time I've started a new job at that higher level, I've had that moment of, well, you know, am I going to crack it? And I think that due humility is important as well. So for me, there was nothing inevitable about this. It was just, you know, the privilege of eventually ending up leading the Air Force. In terms of my philosophy, I think my job is not to try and control and do everything in the RAF. My primary job is to create the environment and the sense of purpose for the RAF to allow others then to do what they do exceptionally well. Yeah. And I've always, for many years, I've had two leadership quotes in mind, and they're both actually from former American presidents. And one of them was Truman, who said, leadership is the art of getting people to do what you want them to do and them liking it. And then the other one was Eisenhower, who said, leadership is the art of getting other people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And clearly, I'm with Eisenhower there. It's not about an orders-based approach. Is that it's about creating the environment, motivating people so that they achieve what you want them to deliver.
I think that's a great note to finish on. Stephen Hillier, Chief of the Air Staff, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much
so much. Thank you.